Sydney is a great city, the best city, but it's the second most expensive city in the world behind only Hong Kong. And by some measures, it's the 800th densest city in the world. And I think those two things are related to one another. For the last 30 years, we've been consistently outbuilt by Victoria and Queensland. To put it in perspective, we build 6 homes per 1,000 residents every 12 months. There's a bit of a measure of output or productivity. So 6 per 1,000 every 12 months. In Victoria, they produce 8 houses per 1,000 people. And in Queensland, it's 9 houses per 1,000 people every 12 months.
I'm Michael Stutchbury, the newish Executive Director of the Centre for Independent Studies. I'm here to welcome you to this special CIS Forum on Housing Policy. Special for at least 3 reasons. First, because of the huge bumper demand for this forum as generated, as shown by the size and the quality of you, the audience, here this evening. Second, because this evening's event validates the work of our Chief Economist, Peter Tulip, who has changed the whole nature of the housing debate in Australia more than anyone by making it all about housing supply. Well done, Peter. And third, it features 2 speakers who are delivering world-leading supply-side reforms on housing policy. The Premier of New South Wales, Chris Minns, and the New Zealand Minister for Housing, Chris Bishop. Now remember that CIS is a not-for-profit organisation, so if you're not already a member or supporter, I'm told I have to ask this, please consider becoming one, including by filling out the forms that are on most of the chairs here. And now can you join me in welcoming Chris Minns, Chris Bishop and Peter Tulip.
So thanks, Michael. My name's Peter Tulip. I'm Chief Economist at the Centre for Independent Studies, and I'll be chairing tonight. I'd like to elaborate a little bit on what Michael said and express some words of appreciation for our 2 speakers. In my view, housing has become really expensive all around the world. And I think there's widespread agreement, both among experts and amongst politicians, that the cause is excessive planning restrictions which limit supply and push up the price. But very few places are actually doing much about it. My perception is that housing policy in Britain, the United States, Canada, and many other places, there's a lot of complaining, but not much meaningful policy. And our 2 speakers here tonight are unusual exceptions to that. New Zealand and New South Wales are 2 jurisdictions where policies have been enacted that will substantially increase housing supply. Now, they aren't the only exceptions. Victoria and some states and cities in North America have also been doing good things. But I think it's fair to say that the housing policies that Chris Minns and Chris Bishop are overseeing are world leading. So the CIS is very honoured that they're here with us tonight to discuss what they've been doing. Our first speaker is Chris Minns, the Premier of New South Wales.
Thank you, Peter. Thanks, everybody, for having me and making the trek out. And anyone who's come from Wallara, don't worry, it'll be a lot easier very, very soon. Can I acknowledge the traditional owners and also the distinguished guests? Thanks, Peter. Thanks, Michael. And also Lucy and Malcolm Turnbull. It's wonderful to see both of you. And welcome our guest, New Zealand Minister for Housing, Transport and Infrastructure, a global champion for housing, the Honourable Chris Bishop. Now, Chris, I understand you're an expert or somewhat of an expert on Australia and Australian culture. So you may already know this, but a month ago, Triple J held a countdown of Australia's 100 greatest songs of all time. And it was a patriotic occasion. And the high point was reached at song number 5 when Australia's favourite songwriter, Neil Finn, sang that great Australian ballad, don't dream it's over. And if you haven't heard of it, Chris, you should look it up. It's a cracker. Which is all to say, in a roundabout way, we are absolutely shameless in this country that if it is produced in New Zealand and it's of substance and it's good, we will brazenly claim it as our own. They say that good artists borrow and great artists steal. And Chris, I can honestly say when Labor came to power in government in New South Wales, we were developing our own housing policy for the state, and we did take direct inspiration from the experiences in New Zealand, particularly Auckland. We watched what you were doing over there. We followed your experiment with new zoning laws, and we took three main lessons from it. One, that when you changed those laws, when you made it easier to build new infill housing in Auckland, supply increased with construction levels doubling in those areas. And then secondly, when you increase supply like that, it put downward pressure on prices, particularly rental prices, which were up to 35% cheaper than they otherwise would have been had it not been for the zoning and planning changes. And three, by putting downward pressure on prices, younger people started to come back into the city, a bit of vibrancy into the city. In neighbourhoods where there was little to no upzoning, you saw the weakest growth in people aged between 20 and 35. And vice versa. It was the same story but in reverse. In the areas with the strongest upzoning, you saw the biggest growth from the youngest demographic. And that's exactly what we need to power a city, a vibrant city, an exciting city. And for us, this wasn't an idle experiment. We paid attention because we were facing not the exact same problems, but far, far worse problems when it comes to housing inequality, and particularly housing inequality between the generations. Sydney is a great city, the best city, but it's the second most expensive city in the world behind only Hong Kong, and by some measures, it's the 800th densest city in the world. And I think those two things are related to one another. For the last 30 years, we've been consistently outbuilt by Victoria and Queensland. To put it in perspective, we build 6 homes per 1,000 residents every 12 months. There's a bit of a measure of output or productivity. So 6 per 1,000 every 12 months. In Victoria, they produce 8 houses per 1,000 people. And in Queensland, it's 9 houses per 1,000 people every 12 months. So even though we've got the highest land prices, the highest increases in land prices, the highest rents, the highest increases in rents, the lowest supply, the worst pressure on young people, we're also building the fewest amount of houses. As a result, we're losing young people every year, twice as many as we're getting back. Last year, it was 40,000 young people packing their bags in the prime of their working life. Now, interstate migration has happened in New South Wales. Generally, it was older Australians moving to Queensland for warmer weather. But now we're losing young people, people that we want to be doctors and nurses and police officers, people that we want to start their own businesses to become entrepreneurs, people that we want to coach football teams and cricket and soccer teams, to join communities and start families, but not here in Sydney, in somewhere else. I think we accepted a culture in New South Wales where it was easy to find an excuse to say no rather than a reason to say yes. And I think that's something Queensland did far better than us. We had a situation where certain local councils, especially, I have to say, some of the wealthier councils, had used their planning powers to make it almost impossible to build homes in those places. Consider one example, but one of many. A few weeks ago, there was an article in the Sydney Morning Herald where they interviewed a group of concerned residents in the suburb of Castle Craig. Now, these residents were opposed to an apartment block that was above, or proposed to be above, some old shops. And it was 11 stories high, but it was 8 kilometres from Sydney's CBD. Now, fair enough, you want to hear them out. You can't just dismiss opposition in a perfunctory way. But then you do some further reading and you find out that in the last 35 years, Castle Craig has built 33 homes in 35 years. And then you read another story, this time from Mossman, where in a remarkable act of candour, a local was asked if she's being entitled when she opposes new housing developments in her community, to which she replied, well, we are entitled. And I thought that probably summed it up. So on one hand, we're preserving certain established suburbs like a National Museum exhibition, whether there's something worth preserving or not, regardless. It's just unilateral and it's completely around some of those communities. On the other hand, and this is the other end of the housing dilemma, we've been adding a new street to the western fringe of Sydney every other week. Friends, a great city can't survive as a museum. A city is an organic, living thing, and it needs to evolve with the times. And that's why over the weekend we made what we thought was an overdue decision to finish Wallara Station so we could build 10,000 new homes within 5 k's of the CBD. Now, some of you might know the backstory here. It's both a slice of Sydney's history, but also an insight into some of the more myopic tendencies that we've seen in the state. When the Eastern Suburbs line was originally established and drawn up in the 60s, there was a spot marked off for Wallara. It was part of the original design, so basic construction was done and the platform was in fact completed. But after a sustained, and it has to be said, successful NIMBY campaign that went all the way to the High Court, the station was scrapped. I think that was the wrong decision. In an attempt to protect Wallara from change, you'd have to say it was incredibly successful, because over that period, in the last 50 years, Greater Sydney has grown by 74%, but Wallara's population has declined by 10%. So there are less people living in Wallara today than there were in 1970, which I think is a window into the culture that we're trying to stop or change in New South Wales. It's a culture of no, a culture that's effectively blocked new housing, pushed up prices, and forced a generation of people to question whether they've got a future in the city that their parents and their grandparents were members of. And to overturn something simple like that, you need more than a single policy. You need transport-oriented developments, low and mid-rise changes, a pattern book approval scheme that gets you a construction within 7 days. You need the Housing Delivery Authority that can come in over councils where necessary and has already approved 70,000 new dwellings for New South Wales. Put together, it adds up to a big change in how the state operates. And when you make a big change, you can expect opposition. Sometimes from the occasional Liberal politician who wants to build a wall around the North Shore, or from Green MPs who say that we need 1 million new houses in Sydney but nowhere near any of our electorates, or maybe 1 or 2 Labor mayors around the joint who say the same thing. But the truth of the matter is we've got to do something about the housing situation. It's an urgent priority for the state. As I said, the HDA has approved 70,000 homes in just 7 months. And they've got the ability to do not just the zoning change, but also the development application change. We feel encouraged here. The movement for housing, driven by the broader YIMBY movement, including, I have to say, Peter, who's been an absolute warrior on Twitter. If you're on Twitter, sign up. It's very entertaining. And I think Michael's right. I think it's shifted for the first time the politics around this debate in New South Wales. Young people have known it for a long time, but the older generation are appreciating that their children are not going to live anywhere near where they live, and perhaps more importantly, their grandchildren are going to live nowhere near where they live. But at the same time, we've got to resist the assumption that NIMBYism is dead and buried, or that it's just lying dormant, because it will. And it is ready to lurch up once again. I have to say, Chris, I've been told that just last week there was a video game produced in Wellington where you can throw a cricket ball at Chris Bishop's head as a protest against his housing policies. But don't worry, Chris, because we tend to bowl underarm to New Zealanders in Australia. But it just goes to show you this fight is very much alive. We have to put our helmets on and we need all the allies that we can get. And in that spirit, I think it's fantastic that we can share. I can stand on a stage tonight with a Liberal think tank, with a Conservative minister on a unity ticket for housing. Because it's always tempting for politicians to run the game that the NIMBY line obviously yields. There's always going to be a devil sitting on your shoulder telling you the easiest way to win a vote is to oppose something. And without wanting to get overly political, because it's not really my style, but I think the Liberal opposition in New South Wales are having some of these conversations right now. I don't think they've made a decision about which way they jump on this important initiative, and I think it's an interesting political debate for them to grapple with. The only thing I'd say is, as they make that decision, I hope they listen to people like Chris Bishop, who are making an incredibly compelling and coherent case right of centre for more homes. And I do hope quite sincerely that when they do decide their position, the forces of housing win over the forces of NIMBYism, because this is far too important to get pulled down into the partisan swamp of politics. Our best chance to hold the line and build the houses we need is a united front across the parties, with every MP who supports the agenda signing on. That's how we can give business certainty. That's how we can attract more capital to the New South Wales housing market. If everybody is sure that the rules will be in place via legislation, regardless of who's in power, from one administration to the other, then they'll invest in New South Wales. And that's how we're going to get people into homes. And that's how we'll give our kids a real sense of the future in this great city. Thanks so much.
Our next speaker is Chris Bishop. Chris is New Zealand's Minister for Housing, for Infrastructure, for RMA Reform, of Transport. He is Leader of the House, Associate Minister of Finance, and Associate Minister for Sport and Recreation. Welcome, Chris.
Well, good evening, everyone. Can I firstly acknowledge the Premier, Chris? Thank you for your bravery in standing up for housing. We need more warriors for housing reform like you across the Western world, so thank you. Can I acknowledge Malcolm and Lucy? Wonderful to see you again. Thank you for coming along. The CIS for making this happen, particularly Peter, who, as Chris says, is a warrior on the platform that we all spend far too much time on, particularly me. And thank you for your advocacy. It's great to be here in the second best city in the world after Lower Hutt, my hometown. And I agreed with everything Chris said, apart from the thing about Crowded House. But I agreed with everything he said, and I hope that tonight won't just be a giant love-in and kumbaya session. But I thought what I would do to kind of add to what he said is talk about three things. I thought I'd talk about New Zealand's experience and the importance of fixing a housing crisis from an economic point of view. And I thought I'd talk about what we've done since 2016 across governments of both stripes. And then I thought I'd talk a bit more about what our agenda is as a government, because we only got elected 18 months or so ago, and we've done quite a bit, but there's a heap more to do. So let me start with the case for saying yes to more housing. Here are some facts. Between 2000 and 2021, inflation-adjusted house prices in New Zealand rose 256%, compared with 64% in the US and 110% in Great Britain. After inflation, house prices in New Zealand have increased by more than any other OECD country in the last 30 years. In 2022, 46% of renting households spent more than 25% of their disposable income on rent, up from 19% in 1988. Now, this week, I've caused a minor stir in New Zealand by saying that house prices have to fall, which is like sacrilegious for a centre-right politician. And Jacinda Ardern, the great progressive hero, never said it. But I just think the flip side of saying that house prices are too expensive is that you want them to fall. Because if you think they're too expensive but you don't want them to fall, you're accepting the problem. So I think house prices do need to fall in New Zealand. The good news is they've come down off their COVID level highs, fueled by all the money printing and the low interest rates. And we're now in a situation where the average house in Auckland's about 7.5 times average household income, which is better than what it was, which was 10, but still too high, because it's still locking a generation out of home ownership. So we've done a lot of good things in New Zealand, but we need to go further. And the truth is that our collective failure to build houses has trapped people in poverty. It's increased inequality. It's made us poorer rather than wealthier. And it's shattered the New Zealand dream of a property-owning democracy. And when I talk to audiences in New Zealand, I try and make 3 points about housing economically. And the first is about productivity, which I understand there's been a bit of talk about in Australia the last week or so. And as Paul Krugman famously said, productivity isn't everything, but in the long run, that is almost everything. And we've had a productivity disease in New Zealand, or lack of it, for the better part of 20 years. And as you all know in this room, if we want world-class health and education, if we want to give better support to those who need it most, ultimately we need to improve our productivity. Now, in the 1950s, our GDP per capita was 125% of the OECD average. Today, it's below the OECD average. And the average New Zealander earns in 1 hour what an Australian earns in 45 minutes. So we're making up for the income gap with other countries by just working longer. The average New Zealander works 370 hours per year more than a person in the UK. It's 9 extra weeks per year, and still our incomes lag. Now, there's lots of things we need to do to fix that, and the Economist has spent a lot of time talking about it. But the thing I keep trying to say to the rest of the Cabinet is the single best thing we can do is fix housing and let our cities grow, because cities are engines of productivity, and the evidence is really clear: bigger is better. So when we stop people building houses, we lock people out of city. It makes us poorer. Cities are engines of innovation. If you go back through history, it's always in cities that transformation and innovation has happened. Amsterdam, London, San Francisco today. Cities bring people closer together. They allow us to mix and mingle, share ideas, increase the likelihood of those chance interactions that change the world. So I keep saying to New Zealanders, let our cities grow. That will improve productivity. And that message is starting to get through. From a fiscal point of view, last year the New Zealand government spent $5 billion on housing assistance. So in a 4-year budget period, that's $20 billion. We pay for social housing, we pay for emergency housing, we pay for transitional housing, we pay for bond payments. It goes on and on and on. And a failure to reform housing has made it extremely expensive for government. So rental support has doubled in the last 7 years. It's an extremely expensive drag on the government books, and that's $1 that's spent on subsidising housing. It's $1 we can't spend on schools and hospitals and roads, better cancer treatment, all of those things. But it's also a moral issue. During the last few years, the New Zealand government spent $1.5 billion housing people in motels. At its height, we were housing 4,500 families, including 3,500 children, in motels. So often living in motels for years at a time. Single studio apartments with kids. State neglect on an industrial scale, entirely self-inflicted by our planning system. So it's not moral to live in a society like that. And the simple truth also is that young kids today in New Zealand don't have the same opportunity to get into the housing market that their parents did, or their grandparents. So it's an issue of intergenerational equity. Now, Chris talked about housing from a not being actually a centre-right or centre-left issue. And I think he's right. Increasingly, the divide is actually generational, if we're honest about it. Because it's possible to make a case for housing reform from a centre-right perspective. I've just put some arguments that the centre-right would find appealing about fiscal stability, about getting costs down for government, about productivity. The thing I talk about with my party at home is the importance of home ownership as a core National Party centre-right value, social stability being important, Thatcher's old dicta about a property-owning democracy. You know, we can't, as Peter Dutton always used to say, how do we expect young people to believe in capitalism if they can't accrue capital? But it's also possible to make it from a centre-left point of view. Human dignity, social justice. Housing connects to all of those things. And actually, it doesn't really matter which way you look at it. You can look at it from a centre-right point of view or a centre-left point of view. The fundamental take-home point, I think, is that housing reform matters. And you can deploy whatever argument suits your purpose for the audience you're trying to persuade to get there. The underlying issue is that housing reform is of critical importance to the future of both New South Wales and also New Zealand. So what have we done? Well, since 2015, there's been a sea change in attitudes towards why we have a housing crisis. And the reality is, for years, New Zealand politicians tried dealing with everything other than the root cause. So first home grants, first home loans, we've had debates about capital gains taxes, can you let landlords deduct interest, ongoing debate about whether or not you should be able to withdraw from your super account to buy a house. To be honest, all of these are distractions. And often they make the problem worse, because they just push up the price of housing, which is the underlying issue. The problem is this: artificial constraints on the supply of developable urban land. Planning is the problem. And the idea that some people push that zoning and land supply doesn't affect affordability is nuts. The evidence is really clear. Cities that make it difficult to build more housing have housing affordability problems. Cities that legalise housing and allow it to be built find it as more affordable. It's really that simple, at least in theory. The solution is also simple, but at least complex politically. So we need to make room for growth both at the edge of our cities and inside our cities. And Chris talked about the Auckland example, which is, I think, instructive. In 2016, Auckland became a super city, a unitary authority. They upzoned 75% of residential land to support medium and high density housing. There was a housing boom, 43,500 additional consents that wouldn't have eventuated without the upzoning. Rents are now 22 to 35% less for a 3-bedroom house than they would otherwise have been. So the evidence is really clear, and as Chris says, it's been internationally studied. In 2020, the previous Labour government in New Zealand did a thing called this National Policy Statement on Urban Development. It's like the worst name in the world. But basically, it's like a layer of planning control that is set by central government that applies to councils. We don't bother with your thing here of state governments. We just go straight from federal down to cities. It's a revolutionary policy. It says local councils must provide at least sufficient development capacity to meet expected demand for housing and for business land in the short, medium and long term. Building heights of at least 6 stories within a walkable catchment of existing and planned rapid transit, the edge of city centre zones and the edge of metropolitan centre zones. It's all planning speak, but basically it's broad-scale upzoning, revolutionary policy done by a Labour government, but I like to think we are continuing the legacy of that and actually making it real. That's bipartisanship in action. Bipartisanship has to be built on good public policy. It was promulgated in the middle of COVID. It's an interesting story. No one noticed it. Housing nerds noticed it. Urbanists noticed it, but nobody else noticed it. And I sometimes wonder if it had been done in sort of normal political times, whether or not it would have even got through. Phil Twyford, who's the housing minister who put it through, sort of openly admits he's not sure if everyone knew what he was doing. But anyway, it's in place and it's working. So our plan is about saying yes to even more. So we're doubling down on what has come before. So freeing up land for development, removing unnecessary planning barriers, sorting out the infrastructure funding system to support growth and incentives for communities. So we're going to set housing growth targets that live zone 30 years of feasible development capacity to provide for 30 years of housing demand at one time. The aim is to flood the market with development opportunities. Auckland's currently doing a new plan. So they've currently got to provide for 900,000 houses in the next few years across Auckland. The new plan will provide for up to 2 million new homes, and we've directed them to do minimum height limits of 15 stories around new rapid transit stations that we've got going in Auckland, 10-storey limits around a few others, 6 stories around the rail network in Auckland. That will be, well, the draft's out, that will be operative, at least in part, by October. We're also enshrining a right to build at the city fringe, as long as the infrastructure costs can cover themselves. My view, if you want to build a 1,000-home subdivision on the city fringe, and you can cover the wastewater and the stormwater on the local roads to make it work, and the new users of those facilities and the new residents can pay for the infrastructure for that, you should be able to. The planning system should not stop you. And actually, the urban economics on this is really clear, that being able to build at the fringe at the same time as you can build in the city suppresses land prices over time, all of which, of course, makes housing more affordable. We're doing a massive program of transit-oriented development in Auckland and Wellington and other cities. We're enabling more mixed use. We're abolishing minimum floor areas and balcony requirements. We're improving infrastructure funding and financing around the principle of growth paying for growth. And at the same time, we're reforming our planning laws. We're going to set standardised zones by central government that all councils have to use. In New Zealand, we have 1,300 different zones across our cities. 1,300 different bespoke zones. Now, Japan has 13. So hopefully we can get down towards the Japan side of things. But 1,300's nuts. And it creates enormous compliance costs and red tape. The new system is going to focus on externalities, not internal effects. So I'm currently having a war with the planners in New Zealand. The new laws will stop council planners dictating to people which way their TVs face. Real example. How big their living room is. Which way the planter boxes on the driveway face. Again, real life example. All of that stuff will be out of the new system. We don't need to involve ourselves in those micro-level decisions. The planning system should not facilitate that kind of behaviour, and it won't under our new laws. Pattern books. I met with Planning Minister today. We're picking up the mantle of the pattern book charge. We're going to do the same thing in New Zealand. I think New South Wales has done a great job. We're going to pick that up. We're having a big debate in New Zealand right now about the role of urban development, the role of government, in urban development. I've been out to Parramatta and looked at what's going on out there. We're building an entirely new investment system for social and affordable housing, which we don't have time to get into tonight. And then this other little thing, which I don't know if you have in Sydney actually, view shaft rules. These artificial lines on maps, planning maps, that mean that you have to protect your views of various things. Sounds good, except when they get in the way of development, they cause billions and billions of dollars of economic loss. I'm not saying we should get rid of all of them in New Zealand, particularly in Auckland, but even minor tweaks can unlock billions of dollars of economic opportunity, which could be better spent in other areas. So we've got a huge reform agenda. Hey, can I just close by saying thank you to CIS for having me. I don't know whether or not I'm a global champion for housing reform, but I'm certainly an Australasian champion. I've been following the debate here in New South Wales and Sydney, and I just think what's going on here is fantastic, and anything we can do to help kick it along, we'll be happy to play our part. And as I say, we're picking up some of what you're doing as well and finding it very inspiring. So thank you very much for having me, and looking forward to the discussion.
I'd like to start with a question about the relationship between central governments and local councils. So in both New Zealand and New South Wales, some of the strongest opposition to what you guys have been doing has been coming from local councils, which is a problem because they're the ones that have to implement a lot of this. Do you have thoughts on how that opposition can be overcome? That's a general question. And a specific question I'd like to ask is, if we set targets for local councils, how do we enforce them?
Yeah, I mean, we've had this long debate about how you set the targets, because at the end of the day, if you just say to them, good luck, they just won't do them. So you have to set some form of target. Now, you can either do it based on dwelling completions, or you can do it based on capacity. And I think you've gone for completions. We're doing capacity because ultimately we've kind of come to this view economically that you've got to get as much capacity as possible, developable land capacity, live zone capacity, to let the economics guide where the development happens, rather than the planning rules. And that's the easiest way to do it. We are looking at whether or not there's a bonus that central government can provide for completions. It's an ongoing debate about that. We haven't quite landed a position on that. But the only way through is housing targets, I think. And look, I sort of liken it to free trade, right? So with free trade, we know that it's good because it leads to economic, comparative advantage. It leads to economic efficiency. It lowers prices over time. But the benefits of free trade are broad and dispersed. No one sort of says I'm better off because of that trade agreement. Whereas the losers of free trade are often quite obvious. The factory that closes down, or the person that loses their job because of the tariffs or the subsidies or whatever. It depends on their circumstance. Housing's a bit the same, where no one moves into a new apartment saying, oh, that is so good. I have got this apartment because Chris Minns rezoned this piece of...
Why not? They can say that.
Well, maybe they will.
I'm counting on it. Okay.
Yeah. But do you know what I mean? Like, no, no one says my rent's now 30% lower. Maybe the apartment thinks, maybe they do. My rent's now 10% lower than it otherwise would have been because of the broad upzoning done by the government 5 years ago. Like, that's quite hard to identify as a cause and effect. But people who are the perceived losers out of housing, they're obvious and discreet, and they're quite noisy and loud, and they turn up often in the evenings at the council meetings and have their say. And they're often a minority, I find. So it's hard. It's a bit like free trade. Anyway, it's difficult. The political economy of this stuff is really challenging.
We go with completions mainly because the ABS data is sort of based on it. The National Accord is on completions, and there's a lot of woolly maths in Australia about construction approvals and we're happy to be held to the highest standard. Can someone move into this bloody thing at the end of it rather than I've got an idea about where housing will go? Targets generally in the past have been routinely ignored by councils, and there's been little enforcement of the targets. And generally speaking, if a council does start meeting their targets, the state government has moved in almost as a course of least resistance and loaded them up with even more. You're almost penalised for playing by the rules and meeting your target. So there's mass resistance to it. In terms of the relationship with local councils, it's mixed, and it's gotten, despite outward appearances in the last few days, we've had really great relations, I'd say, with about 2/3 of the councils. The Liberal Mayor of Canada Bay, the Labor Mayor of Burwood have been fantastic. We want to build on metro lines. They're happy to do it. And I think the key thing that we've perhaps stumbled on, which we didn't anticipate when we began this journey, the Planning Minister, Paul Scully, and myself, is that if everybody's taking a bit and everybody's doing a bit, there's less of a grievance for me and my community. In other words, if I live in Marsden Park, the community's rapidly growing, but if I could see in Wallara they're taking 10,000 as well, well, look, I'm happy to take my share, but I'm not going to take my share and your share. There's got to be a spread, and obviously if you can spread it, it's thinner.
So, to be a little bit parochial, there is a problem with some councils in Sydney. So, North Sydney Council, they're approving housing at about a quarter of their target. In the first year, we've had 1 year now of targets operating. Wallara Council is also just approving very few houses at all. What do you do about that? Do you need to do something about that?
Well, we have the legislative power to override their decisions, and we are doing that. I mean, the Housing Delivery Authority was deliberately established with the view of knocking over a decision of a local council. We don't want to do it. It's not the first instance, but it does both rezoning and development approvals, and we deliberately gave them both of those powers, not just the development approval side, which meant that they were handed the plans for the three most intransigent and difficult councils are Wallara, Mossman, North Sydney and Hunters Hill. They're not just handed the zoning plans for those communities, they can upzone. And they have been doing that. They'll do it for volume builds, for projects above $60 million. Can I also say the establishment of the Housing Delivery Authority is an acknowledgement that the system's failing, by the way. It's almost like an outside the system funnel to get approvals done quickly in recognition of the fact that the squiggly mess that is the planning system isn't working. But I don't have a choice. I mean, we're trying to work through systemic long-term reform, but in the meantime, we needed the HDA to get moving.
We've done a similar thing we've got a thing called the Fast Track Approvals Act. It's a bit the same. While we do the longer-term planning reforms, which we'll legislate by the end of next year, but then we've got the election, and then, they'll start 27, bid it in 28, realistically 29. These things take forever, right? In the meantime, we've got this one-stop shop. It's a bit like your HDA, to be honest, and I've met with your officials to talk about it. It's quite similar. It's just a one-stop shop, rezone land, get the consents through. Because you just got to be able to demonstrate progress, right?
Why don't we throw it open, invite some questions from the audience? Who would like to ask a question?
Jonathan O'Brien from Yimby, Melbourne. Thank you all very much for being here and for a great session. I want to ask about something that we refer to in the Yimby movement, unironically, as the posting to policy pipeline, which is sort of the role of sort of digital communication in sort of changing policy, changing ideas. You've mentioned Peter being, I don't want to say Twitter warrior, that sounds derogative, but Chris, New Zealand Chris, 7th state or 3rd territory, depending how you pay cards, Chris. You have a very combative online presence, in a good way. I think it's really, really positive, and I think it's really, really fun. And I want to know how you kind of handle that, how you manage that, and how you see that as sort of part of what helps you drive change, where you are reforming these real stalwart, dug-in sort of folk.
I don't know if I am that combative anymore. I don't know about that. Maybe that's true. Yeah, look, I mean, there's a number of things to do. I mean, one of the things I do is I give a lot of speeches around the place about housing. You know, the art of political speech making's gone out of fashion. Everyone's obsessed with 30-second sound bites and 1-minute TikTok videos and all this sort of stuff. But the honest truth is the only way to actually articulate a cogent argument and make a case for something is with a speech. So I think speeches, we should bring back the concept of people giving speeches. Anyway, it's just a personal reflection. But so I go give a lot of speeches, and I think over the last 10 years, it's not just me, to be honest, over the last 10 years or so in New Zealand, there's been a intellectual movement, and this is actually quite rare in politics, focused on what does the evidence actually show about housing. And these things often start small. So 2015, the New Zealand Initiative, which is a almost sister organisation to CIS, actually, published a series of reports around why we have a housing affordability crisis, and they were sort of read for a bit. We used to have a thing in New Zealand called the Productivity Commission, which did a whole series of reports around housing and planning, and again, they started to pick up a bit of steam. At the same time, Auckland was doing its work. Auckland Council employed a chief economist who did a lot of work to make the case for change. So these things intellectually build up a head of steam over time, and I think that is really important. And now there's broad consensus in the New Zealand Parliament that the solutions to housing are not all the stuff that's rats and mice and around the edges and first-time grants and all that sort of stuff. It's all on the edges. In fact, as I said in my speech, it often makes the problem worse. The answer is actually planning, zoning, infrastructure funding and financing, stuff that's really boring to most people, but really important. It's like a lot of things in politics. It's the most boring bits that are the most important, but you don't get much credit for them.
Thank you. I'm Enzo from Lilyfield, local to Sydney for 25 years, originally from Canberra. I've got 2 young girls. I'm here with my wife, and our concern is for the future of our children and their ability to buy a home. And we've been in the process of developing modular MMC methods of modular construction for a long time now. And we just wanted to, I wanted to ask both of you gentlemen what you think is the solution for actual housing. I know planning is a big issue, but the actual process of building homes is a big issue because firstly, we don't have the quality, the skilled labourers, the workforce, the people to actually build the homes. So we, as a group from modular background for 20 years, see that we want to bring what Ford did to cars to homes. And what is your take on that? And is that something that you think we would be acceptable moving forward?
Well, thanks, Enzo. Thanks for your question. And I think there's a reasonable history of modular development, particularly in regional New South Wales, where the volume builders, the distance was too great for volume builders to put the base down, then put the frame up, etc. So modular builders did get their start in regional New South Wales, beautiful homes done right across New South Wales, and should have been, I guess, a market leader as we headed closer to Sydney, as we had the dual problems of labour costs and rising costs associated with the inputs, the residential housing construction sector, and inflation was going through the roof. We love it. We think it's really important for metropolitan Sydney in particular. It's been slow out of the box, but the government, in recognition of the fact that we're the second most expensive city on earth, put aside $6 billion for social housing construction in the last budget. We'll build 8,400 new dwellings for New South Wales over the next little bit. Half of them will go to survivors of domestic violence, by the way. And we are using the purchasing power of the state to back small-scale modular builders. So we'll be your first customer or your second customer, and hopefully that scale will continue to grow. And I know Rose Jackson's leading that effort. Is it the silver bullet? It's part of a number of things that we need, and we need them all at the same time.
just in New Zealand, we we're smaller. We've got a real history of one builder, three guys, dog, going to build a house. Well, the reality is that's the truth, and it's really expensive. So we need more scale. Building it costs 50% more to build a house in New Zealand than it does in Australia. Wow. Yeah, there's lots of things that go into that. Building materials competition's been really weak in New Zealand, so we've just changed the law around that, allowing thousands of more building products. We've got real monopolistic supply. We have had historically some monopolistic supply in terms of like plasterboard and stuff like that. So, which we've changed the law about. I didn't cover it in my speech because I'm not the minister of it, and I'm not an expert on it. But we're doing a whole lot of stuff like that, which is really important. And I think the pattern books. Well, if we get that right, pattern books in New Zealand will drive more standardisation and modularisation, more economies of scale as we roll those out. Now, you've got to get them right. We're going to go through a design competition. We don't have a government architect like you do, so we have to probably appoint one. But anyway, so there's heaps more to do. The job is never done. You just keep going.
Who's next? Over here.
In the last 10 years or so, governments have tried certain proposals in order to reduce the price of houses, namely first homeowners grant, and now from October, 5% deposit. Both of these proposals do the opposite of what the government says they're trying to achieve. It puts more money in the hands of young people to bid up at auctions. That's all it does. And now the government's doing a further thing, 5% deposit. Anybody who understands economics understands that's the most useless thing to do, just makes the problem bigger. So let's look at a policy. I'm sorry about this statement. You'll understand my question. Sure. So I hope you'll bear with me just for a second. I won't be long. If you look at what you've talked about tonight, the deduction that I gain is that it's all about, or a lot about, putting apartment buildings, 10, 15 stories, around stations. So what do we have? Little box like two-bedroom houses, which my friend, I won't identify, he's building things like that. He's building 1,000 this year. So I asked him, how much will it cost for two-bedroom? $1.2 million for a two-bedroom apartment. So who can afford this $1.2 million? And then we talk about Wallara. Who's going to move into Wallara? The people who are going to have to spend $3 to $4 million. So I don't really think that anything that the governments are doing and what I've heard tonight is really going to solve the problem. And I hope you don't mind me saying that. I do have a proposal which will solve the problem. Tonight's not the place for it, but I'd really like to understand.
Wait, if you've got the solution, we want to hear
it. Ernie Friedlander is together with me on this. He sends his regards. And I will like to propose it to you, but not in this setting. So I'd like to ask what you brought to the table tonight. How will you get 3 to 4 bedroom houses, which are costing $1.2 million in Glenmore Park, which is near Penrith? How are you going to get those houses to be reduced to $700,000 or $800,000?
You go. You live it's your city. You go.
No. I appreciate your question, and thank you for the sincere way you asked it. I mean, there's a few things that I think I need to respond to. The first one is the logic that we don't just build, or that if we build in high-income, wealthy areas, that won't solve the housing crisis. I think the reverse of that logic means that the only places that we'll build are cheaper areas or less expensive areas on the urban fringe of Sydney, which, by the way, is what we've been doing. And with the specifics of Wallara, What I think people need to take into consideration is the flow-on effect. There are a significant number of people that want to downsize. They're happy to live up and give up their family home in order to move closer to the city and have apartment living. They're not able to do that because the stock's not available. And what we hope to happen, and certainly experience in Auckland and Tokyo and Vancouver, is that as you create more at different levels or different stratas on the cost for housing, you'll see people not crowding out Randwick and Bondi Junction. And the people who aren't crowding out Randwick and Bondi Junction aren't crowding out Leichhardt and Drummoyne. And they're not crowding out Parramatta and Cumberland and so on and so on. But if you don't start in Wallara, you're not going to see any benefit for the area, what I would like to call King George's Road, which is somewhat affordable. Not affordable, incredibly expensive, but less expensive than other parts in Sydney. So I think that's an important part of the conversation. The second part of it is I do anticipate one-bedroom studio apartments to be part of the Wallara development. You can purchase, and I checked before coming here tonight, an apartment in Wallara tonight, even with bugger all stock, for $800,000. That's very expensive, but I do anticipate young urban professionals will buy their first home in a place like Wallara. At the moment, that's not an option. You couldn't go anywhere near a place like that. A couple of kilometres from the city on a brand new public transport line with amazing urban amenity in the most beautiful city on earth.
Can we move on and ask some more questions?
More questions.
Okay, so John?
Is that on? Yeah. John Connor from Nowhere in particular. I'm very pleased, Premier, that I live in Milsons Point. It's an interesting area because it's one of the most densely populated parts of Sydney. We have about, 5,000, 6,000, 7,000 people on our peninsula. I think it's the top 3 in density. And anybody with $3 million can probably find an apartment. Not much for that, but you will get one. So generally speaking, I'm kind of in favour of that. But the problem is that eventually you finish up with many of the most picturesque parts of Sydney, with greenery and with character, being subsumed into the sort of apartment I live in, which suits me fine, but I wouldn't necessarily recommend it to everyone else. And I find that kind of a bit odd as a benchmark, and that North Sydney, for instance, is marked down for not producing enough new buildings when I live in North Sydney and it has a hell of a lot of very large buildings already. But more importantly, perhaps, the whole idea that somehow Sydney is going to have to be 10 million people rather than 5, and that somehow that's a good thing. I really take exception with that, and the idea that also that you get greater intellectual and other vitality the larger the city. And if you look at the US in recent years, that's basically untrue. Seattle has been one of the most imaginative places in the US, and when it started being imaginative, when Microsoft really started to develop, it was quite a small city, and it's not a huge city now. The Delta area around Chapel Hill in North Carolina, which I have some familiarity with, is one of the most productive areas intellectually in the US. It doesn't have a single large city. If you want artistic accomplishment now, you probably go more to New Orleans than you do New York. The development of areas in Texas has not just been in Dallas and Houston. It's been a lot of areas. And I really wonder in this country, I'm not so sure about New Zealand, but in New South Wales, why we don't look far more seriously at decentralisation. Now, whenever I've asked that of a politician in the past, the answer has been, we tried it in Bullabacanka, 60 miles the other side, or 75 or 80 miles the other side of the Great Dividing Range, and it didn't work. That's not the alternative. The real alternatives are the use of our coastline. And if you look at the east coast of the US, you can very easily see how that actually works. Why aren't we doing much more in that area rather than thinking that everybody will come to Sydney?
Well, look, a couple of things I'd say about that. Firstly, people are moving to regional New South Wales at numbers that we've never seen before. And as much as we're speaking about the housing crisis here in Sydney, it is equally as fraught in places like Tamworth and Lismore and Byron Bay and Wagga. The unemployment rate in Wagga, I'm heading there tomorrow, I think, could be corrected, is 2.3. every single business is constrained in terms of growth and opportunity and exploring new export markets and new markets even domestically, because they can't get the labour in. The reason they can't get the labour in because they don't have the housing, because they don't have the housing, they don't have the young people, they don't have the labour. So I'm all for decentralisation, but I can't direct people where to live. And there is an attraction to places like Sydney that is beyond the New South Wales government or the Commonwealth government directing people to do that. And I'm not sure your where you grew up or your background, but there's reasons people chose to live in a beautiful city like Sydney. And the only thing we're saying is the next generation deserve that opportunity as well. And as it stands today, that is not happening. We are not building the homes for them on any objective measure. So something has to change. In the past, New South Wales premiers have been able to sidestep this question in forums like this by saying Sydney's full, can't take any more, population's got to stop. I am not responsible for immigration. And even if I wanted it to stop tomorrow, every indication is that either side of politics is not going to do that. So I can't use that as an excuse. I have to deal with the hand that's dealt me. And if I don't provide those housing based on that current setting and the situation I'm facing, 40,000 people leaving in a single year, well, we will be a city without young people.
We'll try to squeeze, to Chris Johnson, we'll try to squeeze in some more questions and answers, and I'll ask both questions and answers to be brief, please.
Chris Johnson, a former New South Wales government architect. I see the Inner West Council Premier has taken up your three-person system of getting three people, the town clerk or the head of the council, the general counsel and the planning head, to fast-track projects. But they've added a fourth person to it, the city architect. And I think most communities are worried that fast, quicker, getting it up is just going to look terrible. And it's a good signal, I think, back to communities that someone in there is looking at just what it is, how it feels like, what it looks like, the environmental performance and those issues. And a network of people across councils and cities across Sydney could give greater confidence that this faster push can be done well.
Yeah, I think density done well is really the buzzword for us. And if we get it wrong, I know I'm on the hook for this. I mean, one of the reasons why community support for density was so low for such a long period of time is people didn't like what they saw. You know, they'd nominate, I'm not going to nominate the particular suburbs and towns, but they'd see them firsthand and say, oh, I don't want that in my community. So if you're talking about upzoning, I'm out. But if you look at some of the most exciting, vibrant communities around the world, whether it's Williamsburg or places closer to London, they're far denser than Sydney. And just to the point that's been raised a couple of times, people shouldn't believe that Sydney's a dense city. We are the 800th densest city in the world. I mean, we've got a long way to go. And if we just keep growing by adding another street to the Western Fringe, you've got to stretch social infrastructure over a greater plain. And Peter from the Productivity Commission nominated to us that for a house closer to the city, it's about 17,000 in fixed infrastructure or social infrastructure. If it's a greenfield site, it's closer to 70,000, which means everybody's taxes are going up and it's beyond the resources of the government to cover.
Thanks very much. Stephanie Barker, Willow Tree Communications. Now, I think New Zealand Chris has had a good idea for us this afternoon, just looking at how we've been really focusing on infill through the Housing Delivery Authority, and with that 5-year focus, with New Zealand's balanced approach to edge greenfield and also to infill, that we could look at the Housing Delivery Authority having a 10-year focus that could also look at those rezonings where we can actually have that balance. So if there's any ideas around moving to that sort of 10-year focus and to get the momentum that we've got to keep it going through to that 6 to 10 years.
Yeah, I mean, my sort of view is you need to do all of the above. I mean, there's no one answer to any of this stuff. You need. I don't really talk about it, but we're doing a granny flat policy. So I had this hilarious exchange with a seniors crowd one day. He said to me, you know, it won't just be for grannies, right? So, no, anyone can live there. It's not age discrimination or gender discrimination. Anyway, so we call them granny flats in New Zealand. So little, 70. Well, we're doing 70 square metres out the back. So that'll be law as of right by the end of the year. So that's important. It's not a silver bullet. It's not going to solve the housing crisis. My point is just we need housing choice. So it depends where you are. If some people want to live in a 4-bedroom house with a nice suburb, fine, all good. Young professionals want to live in a 1-bedroom apartment by a train station. Actually, they don't really care about how big the living room is, to be honest. They just want to get into their first apartment. They want to live there forever. Maybe they want to rent there. It doesn't matter. Some people want a terraced house. Other people want, walk up. There's duplexes. The reality is the market, people don't necessarily want to believe this, but it's true, right? Over time, the market will build what people want. That's the great thing about markets. The collective action of individual decisions adds up to delivery. And I think it also relates to this question here earlier, which is you've got to be careful, I think, not to confuse the status quo with what happens with dynamic policy over time. So things change and evolve. And, Chris said it in his speech, cities aren't museums. So what is the status quo now in 5 years will be different. Cities change and evolve, buildings get demolished, new ones go up, communities change. And one of the things I say to New Zealanders is, and also that's not going to happen overnight. So, yep, we've upzoned around Kingsland train station, which is all single story character homes at the moment, building $1 billion train station there, and the population's fallen. It's very like Wallara, to be honest, has fallen over the last 5 years. But just because we've allowed 15-storey apartments there doesn't mean there's going to be 15-storey apartments tomorrow. There might be in a couple of years, depending on the market, depending on what people want. The point is capacity doesn't create things. Capacity allows you to do things. It allows the planning environment to allow that to happen. It doesn't mean it happens immediately. It doesn't mean it automatically happens. It allows it. The problem at the moment is we don't allow it. We don't let people build what they want, where they want, because we have these artificial rules that constrain growth. So get rid of the rules and all sorts of good things will happen.
We'll go to final question just behind Stephanie.
Hello, Andrew Punch here from Borkham Hills. One question I have is how much responsibility do councils in employment centres have for housing the workers who actually work in that area? So, as an example, Sydney City Council area, there's 500,000 workers, but there's only housing for 100,000 people. And then North Sydney is the 4th biggest CBD, and you've said they're one of the most difficult councils to deal with. And Chris, I'm sure there's a similar situation in Auckland. Maybe you can talk about that and how the actual workers who are working in central Auckland City are being accommodated by the council, and how much responsibility the council should have for the workers who are working in their area.
Yeah, that's a good question, and I'm not sure. I'll be honest, I'm not sure we've got the answer tonight. We're kind of working our way through it. Industrial lands are important, commercial lands are important. We're a big city, big international city. We've got to have the mix right. And there's always a proposal to swap land usage from commercial to residential. In terms of what their responsibility is, very little. And there's certainly a push, and we've backed in some areas, particularly in North Sydney, for what were previously commercial developments to be flipped to residential. Long term, I'm just not sure what work patterns will do, to be honest with you, though, because there's obviously this real dynamic in the workplace about work from home. But if you speak to every employer, particularly in New South Wales, they want workers back in the office, and young people, this is my experience, want to be in the office. So I wonder whether demographically they will naturally come back in. It's a long way of saying I don't have an answer for you, I'm sorry, but we're looking at it closely.
I'd agree with that, and you can't get too central planning about this, it's like this idea we should have a population policy. It's like, it's basically impossible to set, right? So I've never been in favour of that stuff. What we are trying to do in New Zealand is create more mixed-use zoning, which is just a fancy way of saying you can live and work in the same place. Because there's this idea that we still plan our cities like the 50s, like you live here and then you work over here and you go shopping here on the weekend and all largely car dependent, by the way. It's just not the way people want to live their lives. You know, particularly young people in the inner city. They want to. You live in an apartment. They want to be able to go to the supermarket. They want to go out to a bodega or a coffee shop, cafes. You want to, you know, we've got to sort out the noise restrictions. This nighttime economy thing, that's great. I'll meet with your minister about that.
Yeah.
You know, we need.
Here later tonight.
Yeah, is it? Yeah, it's great.
I'm joking. It's not.
You know, like we're changing all the reverse sensitivity rules in New Zealand because there's too many NIMBYs trying to stop nightclubs, and people move into inner city Wellington and then complain about the bar below. It's like, well, what do you think you're doing? You moved into an apartment above a bar. Where do you get off complaining about it? It's like bugger off. You know? So we're changing all those rules.
Can I
Stupid.
Okay. Final words.
Real quick one. In terms of people living and working where their local communities, I've got to give an enormous amount of credit to the previous government for building metros. Just a game changer. And, you know, you can see its most obvious impact when you run into someone from Melbourne who hasn't been here for a while. Just how good is this? And but anyway, the interesting thing about metros is that it's Sydney's bisected by the Parramatta River and the harbour. It's been this issue that we've had to deal with for a long time, but communities are now almost side by side, even though they're miles from each other, because the metro takes you there in 15 minutes. So Lower North Shore can get to Sydenham and Marrickville like that, Dulwich Hill. It's a really good thing for Sydney. And we're building 25 new metro stations as we speak. But it's got to be, in terms of our planning and design, I think it can be best typified by, we've tipped about $40 billion worth of metros, all of them just about east of Parramatta. But 75% of the development before we started to rejig it was west of Parramatta. And that doesn't make sense. I mean, they built the metros. We've got to have housing on top of transport. That's how big cities grow. We want the same for Sydney.
Yeah, well done.
So, I'm sorry, that's all we have time for tonight. I'd like everyone to join with me in thanking Chris Minns and Chris Bishop.
Thanks, Chris. Well done, mate. That was excellent. It's lovely to meet you too.